He was 12 the first time he understood what it meant to feel completely alone in a crowded place. The classroom was noisy, filled with laughter, whispers, and the screeching of chairs against the floor, yet all he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His name was Ion, and he had always been the quiet one, the boy who preferred books over cricket matches and thoughts over noise. In a city that never truly slowed down, where expectations were as heavy as the summer heat, being different was an invitation for attention, the wrong kind. It began with small jokes about his worn-out shoes and his careful way of speaking English. The laughter that followed those jokes was sharp, like glass splintering against stone, and each day it cut a little deeper. At first, Ion told himself it didn't matter. He convinced himself that words were only sounds, that they couldn't really touch him. But he was wrong. Words have weight. They sink into the heart and settle there, turning confidence into doubt and courage into fear. The boys who targeted him seemed to sense his silence as weakness. They pushed him in the corridors, hid his bag, mimicked his voice in cruel tones. Every insult chipped away at his spirit until he began to believe them. He started to see himself through their eyes, small, awkward, insignificant. And that was the most painful part of all. At home, he never spoke about it. His mother already worked long hours, her hands rough from sewing clothes for neighbors to help pay the bills. His father carried the burden of a modest job and the constant pressure of providing more than he could afford. Ion didn't want to add to their worries. So he swallowed his pain and smiled at the dinner table, pretending that school was just another ordinary day. But at night, when the lights were off and the world was quiet, he stared at the ceiling and wondered what was wrong with him. The bullying intensified in high school. Adolescence sharpened cruelty in some hearts, and the same boys who once teased him now sought entertainment in humiliation. They filmed him tripping in the hallway and shared it in class groups. They scribbled insults on his desk. Teachers noticed but rarely intervened beyond mild warnings. Ignore them, one teacher advised. They'll get bored. But they didn't get bored. They grew bolder. One afternoon, after being shoved into a locker and hearing the familiar roar of laughter behind him, something inside Ion cracked. It wasn't anger at first. It was exhaustion. He was tired of shrinking himself to avoid attention. Tired of pretending not to care. Tired of feeling broken. He went home that day and looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He saw the slumped shoulders, the uncertain eyes. And for the first time, he asked himself a different question. Not, why me? But, what if they're wrong? The idea was fragile, almost foolish, but it sparked something. What if their cruelty wasn't a reflection of his worth? What if it was a reflection of their own emptiness? The thought didn't erase the pain, but it planted a seed of defiance. That night, instead of crying himself to sleep, he opened one of his old notebooks and began to write. He wrote about the locker, about the laughter, about how it felt to stand alone. The words flowed like a river breaking through a dam. For the first time, his pain had a voice. Writing became his refuge. Whenever the world outside felt hostile, he retreated into stories. He created characters who were brave and resilient, who faced storms and emerged stronger. In crafting their journeys, he unknowingly began rewriting his own. His teachers noticed a change in his assignments. His essays were deeper, more vivid. One teacher, Mrs. Rahman, called him after class one day and told him he had a gift. It was the first time someone had used that word about him. Gift. The syllable lingered in his mind long after the bell rang. The bullying didn't stop overnight, but Ion began responding differently. He no longer lowered his gaze. He met their insults with silence that was no longer fearful but steady. Sometimes he even smiled, not out of submission but out of understanding. He realized that the boys who mocked him were desperate for approval, performing cruelty like actors chasing applause. And he refused to be their audience anymore. In his final year of school, an opportunity arose to participate in a citywide writing competition. The theme was resilience. Ion hesitated. The fear of standing out still clung to him like a shadow. But Mrs. Rahman encouraged him to try. Your voice matters, she said gently. So he wrote about a boy who was bullied, broken, but not defeated. He poured his truth into every paragraph, transforming his scars into strength. When he submitted the story, his hands trembled. Weeks later, he was called to the stage during assembly. His heart raced as the principal announced that he had won first place. The applause that followed felt different from the laughter he had grown accustomed to. It was warm, genuine. For a moment, he stood frozen, overwhelmed by the realization that the same halls that once echoed with mockery were now resonating with recognition. He caught a glimpse of the boys who had bullied him. Their expressions were unreadable. But it didn't matter anymore. Winning the competition didn't magically erase his struggles, but it shifted something fundamental inside him. He began to see his past not as a chain dragging him down but as a forge shaping him into something stronger. He applied for scholarships and was accepted into a reputable university. The transition wasn't easy. There were new challenges, new doubts. But he carried with him the knowledge that he had survived worse. University life opened doors he never imagined. He joined a literary club and found people who valued his quiet intensity. He spoke at open mic events, sharing poems about identity and courage. Each time he stepped onto the stage, he felt the old fear whispering in his ear. But he spoke anyway. And every time he did, the fear grew softer. Years passed, and Ion's writing gained attention beyond campus. His stories, rooted in vulnerability and resilience, resonated with readers. He published his first book in his mid-20s. It wasn't an overnight sensation, but it found its audience. Letters poured in from readers who saw themselves in his words. Teenagers who were bullied. Adults who felt broken. They thanked him for giving their pain language. In those letters, he recognized the boy he used to be. One evening, after a book signing event, a young boy approached him hesitantly. His shoulders were slumped in a way that felt achingly familiar. He handed Ion a folded piece of paper and whispered, "Your book helped me." Inside the paper was a short note describing his own experience with bullying. As Ion read it, his vision blurred. He realized that his suffering had not been meaningless. It had become a bridge connecting him to others. He began visiting schools, speaking openly about his journey. He didn't glamorize the pain or pretend it was easy. He spoke about the nights he felt worthless, about the temptation to disappear. But he also spoke about the moment he chose to question the lies told about him. He told students that being different was not a flaw but a form of courage. That resilience was not about never breaking, but about refusing to stay broken. There were still days when old insecurities resurfaced. Healing is rarely linear. Sometimes a harsh comment online would sting more than he expected. Sometimes he would doubt his own voice. But he had learned to sit with those feelings without letting them define him. He had learned that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Years later, at a reunion, he returned to the school that once felt like a battlefield. The building looked smaller than he remembered. The corridors that once seemed endless now felt ordinary. He stood in the empty classroom where so much of his pain had unfolded. Instead of bitterness, he felt gratitude. Not for the bullying itself, but for the strength he discovered in response to it. The broken pieces of his past had formed the foundation of his future. Some of the boys who had bullied him attended the reunion. A few avoided his gaze. One approached him awkwardly and muttered an apology. Ion listened quietly. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need validation. He had already reclaimed his narrative. Forgiveness, he realized, was less about excusing their behavior and more about freeing himself from its shadow. As his career flourished, he never forgot the essence of his story. Bullied, broken, but not defeated was not just a chapter of his life, it was the theme that ran through everything he created. He understood that adversity is not a guarantee of greatness, but a possibility. Pain can destroy, but it can also refine. The difference lies in the choice to rise. Looking back, he sometimes wished he could speak to his 12-year-old self, the boy staring at the ceiling in the dark. He would tell him that the laughter would fade. That the insults would lose their power. That the very sensitivity he saw as weakness would become his greatest strength. He would tell him that one day, he would stand on stages not as a victim, but as a voice. In the end, Ion's story was not about defeating his bullies. It was about defeating the version of himself that believed he was unworthy. It was about transforming wounds into wisdom. It was about understanding that being broken does not mean being finished. The cracks in his spirit had allowed light to enter, illuminating a path he never would have found otherwise. And so the boy who once walked through hallways with his head down now walked through life with quiet confidence. He carried his scars not as symbols of shame, but as reminders of survival. He knew there would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But he also knew something deeper and unshakable. He had been tested in fire and had emerged not untouched, but unbroken. Bullied, broken, but not defeated was no longer just a description of his past. It was a declaration of who he had become, a brave soul who rose not because the world was kind, but because he chose not to surrender to its cruelty.